So this obviously, one more time, I want to make sure the audience understands the thesis statement before Dr. Brown begins his 17-minute opening statement. Does Romans 11:25 through 27 state that there will be a national turning of the Jewish people to God? Are there any Old Testament or New Testament promises made to ethnic Israel that remain to be fulfilled? That is the thesis statement today. I hope as you listen, you will keep that in mind and listen very carefully to the presentations as they are made. And so with that, I would like to invite Dr. Michael Brown to begin his 17-minute opening statement. Michael, your time begins.
Great. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to do this. Thank you, Don, for accepting the challenge to debate these. In fact, coming to me and saying, let's debate them. And James, thanks for moderating. What I want to do is scope out what Paul wrote in Romans 9 through 11 so we can get the larger context. And we can see without question whatsoever that Paul was looking forward to the future national turning of the Jewish people to Jesus, the Messiah. The context of Romans 9, of course, is Paul had not been to Rome. He wanted to make sure that the Romans understood the gospel message. And as he closes Romans 8, no one can separate us from the love of Messiah. The question could easily come up, well, what about Israel? What about the Jewish people? Paul's heart was heavy, burning over these issues because his own people as a nation had rejected the Messiah. He was wishing he'd be cut off from them. But he says this in Romans 9:3, they are Israelites, 9:4, and to them belong, present tense, the adoption, the glory, the covenants, and, the end of the verse, the promises. So the promises and the covenants still remain. There are many promises that God had given to Israel that had not yet been realized, including a national turning of the people, including the earth being filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the seas, including the end of war and conflict on the earth, and including a national turning of many nations in the world to God. For me, the future is bright as the promises of God. I hold to an eschatology of victory, not defeat, God's purposes being accomplished in the midst of conflict, chaos here on the earth. Now, in Romans 9:6, Paul explains that not all who are descended from Israel belong to Israel. In other words, there is a remnant of believers within the nation, the Israel within Israel. Paul never in his writings explicitly calls the church Israel or explicitly calls Gentiles Israel. He may call them the circumcision in the spirit. He may say they're part of the commonwealth of Israel. But here he's speaking of the believers within the nation, the Israel within Israel. He uses it in that sense, but notice as he continues his argument that he is distinguishing between Jews and Gentiles. He is distinguishing between Israel and the Gentiles. And as he continues his argument in Romans 9, 10, 11, every time he speaks of Israel, he is speaking of ethnic Israel. He says in 9:24 that God's called people not from the Jews only, but also from the Gentiles, making a distinction between Jew and Gentile in the body. 9:27, Isaiah cries out concerning Israel, meaning whom? The ethnic people, the nation. Though the number of the sons of Israel be as the sand of the sea, only a remnant of them will be saved. And then he speaks of the Gentiles in verse 30, that the Gentiles who did not pursue righteousness have attained it, but Israel, 9:31, pursued a law that would lead to righteousness, did not succeed in attaining righteousness. Again, Israel here is ethnic national Israel. He says he has a burden for them, for their salvation, that they may be saved. They have a zeal for God, but not according to knowledge. Speaking of whom, again, ethnic Israelites. Then he says in 10:19, did Israel not understand? Who is he speaking of? Ethnic national Israel. And then he quotes passages to say, no, they didn't get it. And then closes the chapter, 10:21, of Israel, the Lord says through Isaiah, all day long have I held my hands out to a disobedient and contrary people. So every time, consistently, clearly, after saying there's an Israel within Israel, when he speaks of Israel, he's not speaking of Gentile believers. He's speaking of national ethnic Israel. Just a simple exegesis of the text, not importing anything from any other passage into it, just reading these texts here. Well, that leads to the obvious question, has God rejected his people? Is God finished with Israel? Paul says by no means. And he first explains that there is a remnant of believers like him. In every generation, there is a remnant of believers, just as there was in Elijah's day, 7,000 who didn't bow the knee to Baal. So also there is a remnant of believers here. And he even mentions Elijah making appeals to God against Israel in 11:2. Who does he mean by Israel? National, ethnic Israel. Now, verse 7. What then? Israel failed to obtain what it was seeking. Why am I reading all these passages? Simply to say that Paul is using Israel to speak of ethnic, national Israel after making reference to an Israel within Israel, a remnant within the nation. He now uses Israel, speaking exclusively about ethnic, national Israel. Now, notice this. Verse 12, if their trespass means riches for the world and their failure means riches for the Gentiles, how much more will their full inclusion mean? Have we seen Israel's full inclusion yet? No, of course not. And notice what Paul says in verse 11. Did they stumble in order they might fall, or fall beyond recovery? The implication, by no means, rather through their trespass, salvation has come to the Gentiles so as to make Israel jealous. So Paul had every opportunity here to refer to the Gentiles as Israel. He doesn't. He refers to them as Gentiles and says that their role is to make Israel envious, enjoying the covenant blessings, the riches of the Messiah, the forgiveness of sins, and thereby making Israel envious as the Gentiles have what covenantally belonged to them. And just as their turning away has opened the door in God's sovereignty for the Gentiles to be saved, so their turning back will bring something extraordinary on the earth that has not yet happened and to which we are still looking forward. He says this, I'm speaking to you Gentiles inasmuch then as I am the apostle to the Gentiles. I magnify my ministry in order somehow to make my fellow Jews jealous and thus save some of them. So his immediate goal is the salvation of a remnant among the people. His immediate goal is the saving of some of them. He is looking forward to their full inclusion. For if their rejection means the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance mean but life from the dead? If the dough offered as first fruits is holy, so is the whole lump. And if the root is holy, so are the branches. He then gives a warning about Gentile arrogance, and obviously the idea that the Gentile church has replaced Israel or that God is finished with Israel. He gives a very strong word of warning. And of course, by not heeding the warning through the years, the church has become arrogant. Supersessionism has come in. And while there are Christians today who hold to replacement theology, who hold to supersessionism, who are absolutely not anti-Semites, through history, unfortunately, the idea that God was finished with Israel, the idea that the Jewish people were just accursed to scatter under judgment, the idea that the church had replaced Israel opened the door wide to a horrible history of anti-Semitism, which we still have to undo in witnessing with Jewish people who often associate Jesus with the horrors of much of church history. Paul continues explaining how natural branches can be grafted back into their own tree. And then he says this in verse 25, lest you be wise in your own sight, I do not want you to be unaware of this mystery, by which he means something in God's plan of salvation, which has been previously hidden but is now being revealed. What is the mystery? A partial hardening has come upon Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. Let's understand a couple of things here. It is a partial hardening because it's not over all the people of Israel. There is a remnant like Paul who believes, or like me as a Jewish believer today. And it's partial in that it is not for all time. The veil will be lifted and there will be a turning. How long will this hardening last? Until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. Is there still a hardening on Jewish hearts towards Jesus? Yes. This has not yet come to pass. Has the fullness of the Gentiles come in? In accordance with Revelation 7, for every tribe and tongue and kindred and nation, there remain about 2 billion people in the world today who have never heard the name of Jesus. They remain unreached tribes and tongues. The fullness of the Gentiles has not come in. And if that fullness includes unity and coming to the fullness of the knowledge of God, as Paul speaks of in Ephesians 4, and as Jesus prayed for in John 17, that clearly has not happened yet, or we wouldn't be having a debate about these issues as brothers in the Lord, both earnestly seeking the truth. So this has not yet happened. There remains this hardening over the hearts of Israel. The fullness of the Gentiles has not yet come in. And then Paul says this, and in this way, or so, all Israel will be saved. As it is written, the deliverer will come from Zion. He will banish ungodliness from Jacob. Now, let's notice he's not referring to the church here. The church is not Jacob. The church in the New Testament is never referred to as Jacob. Also, when Paul says all Israel, as many exegetes and commentators note, it's impossible that he has a different Israel in mind in verse 26 than he has in verse 25 or in the previous 10 references when he's referred to Israel, which is why I read these texts. He's referring to national ethnic Israel, and he says there will be a national turning. Has it happened yet? No. Has the national mourning that that Zechariah speaks of in Zechariah 12:10 to 13:1, resulting in national cleansing, has that happened yet? Absolutely not. And notice it's at a future time yet when Israel is surrounded by the nations and armies of the world. That has not happened yet. It's looking forward to a future time when the Redeemer himself touches down in Jerusalem, returning, as Acts 1 says, just the way he came back and is laid out in Zechariah 14. That has not yet happened. That coming of the Redeemer that Paul speaks of in 2 Thessalonians 1, where he says it'll come in flaming fire, taking vengeance on those who don't know God, at which time we will receive relief from persecution. That has not yet happened. The event of Revelation 1:7, when every eye sees him and all the nations of the earth mourn because of him, that has not yet happened. The event that Paul looked forward to in 1 Corinthians 15 and 1 Thessalonians 4, where we will literally be physically resurrected and our bodies will put on immortality, that has not yet happened. If Jesus does not return to this earth in our lifetimes, we will all still physically die. This mortal has not yet put on immortality, which Paul spoke of as yet to come. And we become like Jesus in his risen, glorified form that 1 John speaks of as well. These are things we are yet looking forward to. The last days of which Isaiah spoke. We understand the last days has different meanings in different contexts, but clearly it's not speaking of the end of the Old Covenant period. Rather, it's speaking of the day when there'll be no more war on the earth, when all the nations will come and worship God in Jerusalem. That has not happened. If words have any meaning, those things have not yet happened. When Paul says, in this way all Israel will be saved, he's either speaking in a temporal manner after the turning of the Gentiles, after the fullness of the Gentiles comes in, or he's speaking in a consequential manner, provoked by the fullness of the Gentiles, provoked to jealousy by the fullness of the Gentiles, all Israel will be saved. This is the hope of the prophets. You can read passages like Jeremiah 31 to 33 or 30 to 33. They begin with promises of the return from exile in Babylon, but many of the things prophesied still did not happen, where God says at that time he'll be the God of all the families of Israel. That did not happen yet. When Israel's salvation will bring the fullness of the glory of God to the world, as Paul spoke of. Even as we look in Isaiah 59, from whence he quotes, we see leading into Isaiah 60, these are things that have not yet happened, if words have any meaning. Passages like Isaiah 11, where the wolf lies down with the lamb, and where there's no more war, and there's universal knowledge of the glory of the Lord under Messiah's reign. These things have not yet happened in this fallen and broken world in which we live. And even Isaiah 27, which Paul also quotes from as part of the apocalypse of Isaiah, Isaiah 24 to 27, which speak of the end of the age and speak of the final triumph of God and the final destruction of Satan. We have not yet seen that take place on the earth. In this way, all Israel will be saved, as it is written, the deliverer will come from Zion. Paul apparently adding in a quotation from Psalm 14 to Isaiah 59, speaking of deliverance coming from Zion, to the people of Israel, to ethnic Israel, even in exile, even in the land from Zion, from the Messianic Redeemer. He will banish ungodliness from Jacob. That has not happened. Those who say that that AD 70 is the second coming of Jesus, while I don't downplay the importance of the event, while I don't downplay the importance of the destruction of Jerusalem in Isaiah 70, while I don't downplay the idea that God came in judgment in a certain way there, that is a work of judgment, whereas Paul is speaking of a work of salvation. What he looks for here has not yet happened, and this will be my covenant with them when I take away their sins. The new covenant was inaugurated with the remnant. It has not yet gone to the nation as a whole, and it is promised to Israel and Judah in Jeremiah 31. What's fascinating is immediately after the new covenant promises in Jeremiah 31, verses 31 to 34, that Jeremiah, then speaking for the Lord, makes clear that God is not finished with Israel and says no matter what they do, they will still be preserved as a people. And we see that we have been scattered around the world under divine discipline and judgment and hated by the nations and still preserved. How did that happen? God keeps his promises. Just like when he brought Israel in the land, The historians, the writers said there's not one promise he made he didn't keep. Well, he didn't just promise to bring them into the land, but to keep them there. And if we were scattered, to bring us back, even in disobedience and rebellion, he would bring us back for his namesake, according to Ezekiel 36. What's prophesied there has not fully taken place. As well, we can see that the only one that could regather the Jewish people to the land is God. When he blesses, no one can curse. When he curses, no one can bless. When he opens the door, no one can shut it. When he shuts the door, no one can open it. When he scatters, no one can regather. And yet we see that the Jewish people, 6 million strong, the same numbers were killed in the Holocaust, are living in Israel today, regathered. How did it happen? Was it just statehood, political craftsmanship, self-will? No, because we were scattered under divine judgment. It is only God who can regather us. We are witnessing God at work in history today in front of our eyes. It's another reason I'm so filled with optimism and hope and expectation and hold to an eschatology of great victory. Now, Paul continues and says this, as regards the gospel, they, who? Israel, all Israel, the nation, the one of whom he has been speaking. It is impossible to exegete this as meaning the church, that all Israel means the church. It's also impossible to exegete it as saying it just means the remnant of all the previous generations. He's talking about a climactic future act. He's talking about a turning from sin among the Jewish people that has not yet happened. And he's talking about it in conjunction with the coming of the Redeemer. As regards the gospel, they, who? The Jewish people, are enemies for your sake, but as regards election, they are beloved for the sake of the forefathers. It has nothing to do with Israel's goodness. It has to do with God keeping his word. It has nothing to do with the ethnic superiority of a group. It has to do with the faithfulness of God. He who started the work will finish it. And there are many promises that remain yet for Israel. Read through the prophetic books. Read through Isaiah. Read through Jeremiah. Read through Ezekiel. Read through these many passages. There are so many passages that have not yet come to pass, but they will, because God keeps his word. We have not yet seen the renovating of the universe, according to 2 Peter 3, and the burning up of the elements with fervent fire, and a new heaven and a new earth where there's no more death or sorrow or pain, in which righteousness dwell. And Peter tells us in Acts 3 that God will keep all the promises he made through the prophets of the restoration of all things. That has not yet happened. And so Paul closes with this: for the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. As surely as God is God, the one who scattered the Jewish people around the world has brought them back, and he will continue to do so. He will turn our hearts, and there will ultimately be a national turning. Not necessarily every single Jewish person, but as the fullness of the Gentiles comes in, there will be a national turning of the Jewish people back to God. So it is written.
Demonstrating, of course, that he does have his own radio program. Dr. Brown finishes within approximately 0.7 of a second of exactly where he needed to be. So I congratulate you